Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me here today. I would like to begin with a brief land acknowledgement, and we are currently on Dish with One Spoon territory. If you are not familiar with the covenants, I highly recommend reading into it, learning a little bit about the history of the land on which we stand. And one acknowledgement that I'm going to borrow from a fellow defense lawyer, the Dish with One Spoon territory basic principles: take what you need, leave something for someone else, and keep things clean. So with that said, it's an honor to be here, and thank you to Andrew Monkhouse for offering me this opportunity and for not pulling my speech when I asked him earlier today whether I am allowed to swear or not. I will keep things civil. I'm speaking a little bit about access to justice, pathways to law, and I'm going to do my best to loop it into the case that you've all been immersed with. So buckle up, I'm in for a little bit of some conflicting advice, and anyone who is interested in pursuing law, you will soon find that there are no right answers, it always depends. So you need to take a contextual look at your situation. If there are pieces of advice that are useful to you, keep it, and if not, please discard. There is really only one constant in what I am going to suggest to you, and that's whatever endeavor you choose to pursue, guard your reputation and do so zealously. A little bit of background about me and my practice, and hopefully we will glean some lessons along the way that may be applicable to your own lives. As Andrew mentioned, my practice is primarily based in housing. I also do cannabis law and some criminal defense. My pathway to law was fairly typical. I finished my undergraduate studies in international development, had no real concept of what I would do for a real job, and applied to law school. And so I went to law directly from my undergrad, kind of thinking that I would find my feet as I went. I did do a brief stint on Bay Street, and for those who are not familiar, that is kind of the financial hub in Toronto, sort of what you would picture if you are a fan of Suits. That's the life I was living, except far less glamorous, and not at all to my liking. And in fact, when I did finish my summaring and articling on Bay Street, although I was at an excellent firm surrounded by very, very smart people, I had to take some time to think about what I actually wanted to do with my life. And I wasn't sure. I had something of an existential crisis. I didn't even know if I wanted to practice law. And so I took a few months. I spent time in courthouses just observing. And I was watching not only lawyers and paralegals, but also the clients, the judges, really just taking in what happens in our justice system. And it was by fluke that I landed an early client. I ran into a mentor who didn't want the case and passed it my way. It was a landlord-tenant matter, and it actually developed into something of media interest. So if you're interested, if you Google racism in Rosedale, that was one of my first cases. And that catapulted me into the world of landlord-tenant. That's how I ended up where I am. In fact, I had registered for the course while I was in law school, didn't like it very much, and dropped it the second day. So that's to say, I suppose another lesson to take away, you never really know where you're going to end up, and that's okay. So, okay, I had my fluke first case. I landed another early client who was a media situation, not by accident, but through strategy. And I had picked up a newspaper, read the story of Michael Storms, another very interesting person to Google, and I wrote him a letter while he was in the Toronto South Detention Centre. And he was interested in what I had to say. We had a meeting, and we actually developed a solicitor-client relationship that has now that he's no longer a client in any sense, it has now transformed into a friendship. And the name Michael Storms is important because I'm actually going to provide some advice from him that he would like to convey to this audience as well. but you'll have to wait for that till the end. All of these cases and doing some media work has led me to do a fair bit of media advocacy. And, it can be a double-edged sword, so you have to think carefully about your work, whether it's with newspaper, radio, etc. But what I have done for my own practice is where it's appropriate, I will try to get coverage for client stories where there's something that would benefit the public to know about. I also comment on developments in law. So when there are changes in cannabis law and policy, or features on housing law in the current rental market in Toronto and Ontario and possibly globally, these are all very pressing issues. And I mention this because another lesson to take is find your niche. There is for sure something that you are interested in, that you're passionate about. Find that and be a huge nerd about it, and be unapologetically nerdy about what you're interested in. It doesn't mean that you have to pigeonhole yourself and only stay in those parameters, but by finding something that you know and care about and you can be the expert on, that sets you apart. There are also times where my media advocacy has involved me becoming part of the story. And I'll share this brief anecdote. When the first brick and mortar store dispensary opened in Toronto, I was actually camped outside. Not because I was excited to get my hands on government weed, but because it was an opportunity to really blast the government's policy on how they decided to distribute these licenses. And so the lesson to take from there is find opportunities, make your own opportunities, because not everything will be handed to you on a platter. Sometimes it does fall from the sky, but other times you have to make it happen for yourself. Another lesson to take from my early years in practice, and if you haven't put it together from now, from the time I left Bay Street till today, I simply started my own shop and I hung up my shingle, and that's because I was in a position where that made the most sense. And one thing that was a hard lesson to learn is you can't help everyone all the time. I reached a point where volume was overwhelming. It was difficult to meet my various obligations, not just to clients and the court and opposing counsel, but also in terms of my family, my friends, and my own sort of sanity. And the lesson here as well is to recalibrate often. Take stock of your situation, figure out what's making sense, what's not making sense, and adjust yourself accordingly. What I had to do was raise my rates and take on a lower volume. But I found that a lot of the fulfilling work that I was doing with more low-income clients, that left something of a gap. So another lesson, figure out how you can piece things together in your life. What I have done is I'm a lot more frequent with my public education efforts. I host monthly meetups at my office where people can come in and do something of a Q&A, particularly for landlord-tenant and criminal matters. And I also do public outreach like these kinds of events. So it's, again, a pleasure to be here. That's the gist of my story, and you can take from it what you will. And hopefully, one of the lessons you will glean is that no matter where your journey takes you, you should dream big and, again, be unapologetic about pursuing your goals. I will say a couple of words of caution and some caveats. These are in no particular order, and I'm not looking to discourage anyone, but I think a tenet of my practice is to keep it real. So the first thing to consider, law is expensive. So research the job market. Think about financing your degree. You may need to consider alternatives to law school before you take that jump. You may consider doing a paralegal program, which is shorter, less expensive, and can be equally fulfilling, a lot of work. The practice in and of itself is a profession to its own, and it can also be a launchpad for future endeavors, so take that seriously. Don't give up because of the cost, because we do need diverse voices in law. It's essential that we have people from various socioeconomic backgrounds. What I'm saying is be sure to have a plan. And remember, that plan can change and be flexible. Second warning, law is a very jealous mistress depending on how you practice, okay? So what I mean by that is you're going to spend long hours, and that's not just you sitting in the office. It could be obsessing about your cases on the commute home, sort of lying in bed thinking about how should I have done that differently. If you care about your work, it will consume you. Know your goals, right? If you know what you're looking to get out of the profession, it makes it a lot easier to tailor your life, your working life, to those objectives. So that can mean that you are doing in-house counsel, policy work, maybe you want to litigate, maybe you are looking for a 9-to-5 practice, perhaps you want a law degree to do something totally non-related to law. Those are all valid options. And the last word of caution is that law is a difficult landscape to navigate, not just because of the long hours, but it's a very lowercase c conservative profession. There is resistance, there is pushback to progress. Even though lawyers are the architects of some of the most progressive human rights legislation and rights-bearing pieces of law. So there's an irony there. And again, that's why we need diverse voices in these positions. And it's illustrated by the refusal of some senior counsel to use email right to this day. There are ongoing organized efforts within the Law Society against promoting equity and diversity. There are people who are hell-bent on keeping the profession pale and stale. They cannot win. Again, my message is not to give up, but rather to be smart, find your support networks, and work towards your goals. I will conclude with some final thoughts that are relevant to the case you've been studying, might be sick of hearing about. I was speaking with Michael yesterday, and by the way, he's out, he's doing well. And I asked him, what advice would you provide? And don't scoff, because consider that you can actually learn something from everyone, right? Everyone has something, and so an important quality to cherish as a lawyer is humility. And Michael had 2 suggestions. First, if you can help, try to help. You should just effing do it. And number 2, and again, very pertinent to today, don't be an a-hole. Thank you all for having me.